In the depths of Mississippi's swamplands, where the air is thick and time itself seems to stall, one family carried a secret so disturbing it would haunt generations. It wasn't whispered folklore. It wasn't rumor. It was real, documented, investigated, and buried for years. Imagine stumbling upon a home where children were born, twisted by fate, where the walls echoed with silence instead of laughter, and where a legacy of isolation turned into something darker than anyone could have imagined. This is the story of the Caldwells, a family hidden in plain sight, cut off from the world, and entangled in a scandal so grotesque it shook Mississippi to its core. It's a tale of control, manipulation, and the devastating price of secrecy. And yet, beneath the horror lies an unsettling question. How could an entire community, an entire system, look the other way for so long? Before we dive into this chilling case, do me a favor. Hit that like button so more people can discover these hidden stories. If you're new here, subscribe and join our community that digs up the dark truths history tried to bury. And hey, if you know someone who's into mysteries that push the boundaries of belief, share this video with them. It helps us keep uncovering the untold. Deep in Humphreys County, Mississippi, there was a stretch of swamp so thick with cypress trees and stagnant water that locals called it Devil's Swamp. Few dared wander near, fewer still lived inside. Among the shadows of moss-draped branches stood a crooked house, weather-beaten and silent, leaning like a tired soldier after too many battles. It was here the Caldwell family lived, hidden from curious eyes. The property seemed to breathe isolation. During summer, the dirt road disappeared beneath floodwater, cutting the house off completely. It wasn't just geography. It was as if the swamp itself guarded their secret. Neighbors in the nearby town of Boulogne rarely saw the Caldwells. On the rare occasions they appeared for supplies, townsmen noted their nervous glances, quick movements, and the unshakable sense they were carrying something unspeakable. Elijah Caldwell had returned in 1957 after tragedy took both his parents in a sudden car wreck. He was only 22 then, thin, restless, and strangely detached from the rhythms of normal life. He came back to live with his grandfather, Silas Caldwell, an older man hardened by loss and isolation. Silas had lived alone for years, his stoic silence broken only when Elijah stepped back onto the property. Silas welcomed his grandson with the quiet intensity of someone unwilling to let go of the last strand of bloodline. For him, Elijah wasn't just family, he was survival, continuity, a legacy worth guarding. Locals whispered about Silas's temper. They remembered his cold stare, his long absences, his sharp distrust of outsiders. Boulogne was small, and gossip was currency. Yet even gossip kept its distance from Devil's Swamp. The house itself told stories. Its walls were patched with scavenged boards, old nails bent back into use, and windows cracked yet covered with newspaper clippings. Inside, light rarely touched the rooms for long. Some swore they heard screams drift across the swamp at night. Others dismissed it as the wailing of animals. But for the few who knew the Caldwell name, unease clung heavier than the humid air. Elijah tried life in Memphis before returning, but he never adjusted. He struggled with people, with rules, with expectations. In Boulogne, he was remembered as strange, a boy who walked alone, eyes always lowered. When he came back, neighbors hoped tragedy might soften him. Instead, he seemed even more withdrawn. He spoke little, avoided gatherings, and clung to his grandfather's side like a shadow bound by blood and silence. The swamp isolated them physically, but it also insulated them socially. Boulogne had churches, schools, gatherings, but none of that reached Devil's Swamp. The Caldwells built their own world, and no one intruded. Still, rumors persisted. Why were they so secretive? Why did Elijah never speak of finding work or building a future? And why did Silas seem to guard him as if protecting something fragile? That first summer back, hunters passing near the swamp claimed they saw strange figures by the house at dusk. Figures that didn't move quite right, hunched and slow, as if carrying unseen burdens. The hunters kept their distance. In small towns, curiosity often comes with a warning. Don't pry too deep. And so the Caldwells' isolation hardened, fed by silence, by fear, and by the swamp itself. The house became a symbol of unease, a dark silhouette rising above the misty water. And within its walls, something was unfolding, something that would remain hidden until the world could no longer look away. The Devil's Swamp was more than a backdrop. It was a cocoon of shadows, a stage for secrecy, and the first character in a story of darkness that Mississippi would never forget. The summer of 1962 was sweltering, even by Mississippi standards. Heat pressed down like a weight, trapping every whisper in the small town of Boulogne, and whispers about the Caldwells were growing louder. At first, it was small talk in the grocery store. Why did Elijah always seem so restless, darting glances like a man hiding from shadows? Why did Silas never allow anyone near their swamp road? Then came something that shook the community. In October, word spread that Silas's household had brought a newborn to the hospital, but the birth wasn't ordinary. It was shocking, disturbing, and shrouded in secrecy. Doctors were stunned. The grandfather, Silas, was old. Elijah was still young, but neither man offered answers when asked. They stayed silent, their eyes cold, as if explanations didn't matter anymore. The baby itself told its own grim truth. Doctors noticed deformities, fused fingers, an unusually small head, and features that whispered of something deeply wrong. It wasn't just chance. It was something much darker. When pressed for details, Silas offered nothing. Elijah stood mute. The staff was unsettled not only by the child's condition, but by the silence of the men who had brought him. A hospital orderly whispered that the elder Caldwell scrawled false names on the forms, refusing to answer who the father was. His refusal wasn't defensive. It was calm, chilling, like he carried certainty in his secret. Boulogne buzzed with theories. Some thought Elijah had a hidden companion deep in the swamp. Others believed Silas harbored shameful truths from his own past. But none guessed the reality lurking behind the swamp walls. As rumors grew, so did suspicion. Neighbors remembered seeing other children before, figures glimpsed through trees, their movements uneven, their features strange. Were there more? Were these children hidden from the world deliberately? Sheriff James Wilson couldn't ignore the stories forever. In a town like Boulogne, rumor could become hysteria, and hysteria could turn violent. Quietly, he sent a deputy to watch the Caldwells' movements. Deputy Robert Thompson, young and eager, began making trips near Devil's Swamp. At first, he saw little. The house stood as it always had, silent, sagging, surrounded by water and heavy, insect-thick air. But then he heard it. Cries in the night, sharp and unnatural, not quite animal and not quite human. The sound chilled him, even though he told no one at first. The next time, he brought binoculars. Through branches, he glimpsed children moving in the yard, their steps awkward, their frames twisted. They didn't speak, only followed Elijah, who seemed both caretaker and prisoner. Thompson wrote everything in his journal, certain something sinister was unfolding, yet part of him hesitated. How do you accuse men who live outside society's rules? What if the truth was worse than rumor? Meanwhile, Boulogne simmered. The grocery clerk told stories of the Caldwell men buying unusual amounts of food, rushing away as though being chased. Hunters avoided the swamp entirely, swearing they saw strange silhouettes near dusk. And then came the turning point. Another Caldwell child fell gravely ill. Pneumonia drove them back to town, forced them into the open again, and the doctors could no longer pretend this was a normal family. The truth was clawing its way into daylight. Rumors had turned into suspicions, suspicions into evidence, and the swamp's silence was finally cracking, revealing horrors no one in Mississippi had ever imagined. The summer of rumors was ending, but what followed was far darker. What began as whispers in a grocery store would soon unravel into one of the state's most disturbing scandals. Sheriff James Wilson wasn't a man easily rattled. A veteran of small-town politics and darker backroads disputes, he'd seen desperation in many forms. But the Caldwell case carried a weight he couldn't ignore. Deputy Robert Thompson's reports unsettled him, scribbled notes about strange cries, deformed children, and Elijah's haunted presence. Wilson read the entries by lamplight, wondering whether the swamp was hiding something more than simple poverty. The Caldwell property was known as Devil's Swamp for a reason. Its dirt road flooded most of the year, and even when dry, it twisted like a serpent, discouraging any casual visitor from intruding. Wilson knew he had to tread carefully. Boulogne wasn't a place where outsiders welcomed interference. Even in town, people whispered about minding your own business, about not poking at nests you couldn't control. But Thompson pressed him. The deputy's young eyes carried conviction. He insisted children were suffering out there, hidden away like shadows, trapped in a world no decent lawman should leave unchecked. One foggy morning, Wilson accompanied Thompson to the swamp's edge. Together they watched the sagging Caldwell house from a distance, binoculars fogging, eyes straining for proof that would justify crossing private ground. They saw Elijah first, leading two boys into the yard. Their bodies moved awkwardly, their limbs crooked, faces marked by features the sheriff couldn't mistake as normal. Wilson felt a hollow pit form instantly. He lowered the binoculars, jaw tightening. This wasn't rumor anymore. It was reality. Painful, undeniable. The swamp wasn't just isolating the Caldwells. It was concealing children who had been born into something unnatural. Thompson asked if they should intervene immediately, but Wilson shook his head. He knew charging in would risk resistance, or worse, send Silas and Elijah deeper into secrecy. They needed evidence that couldn't be dismissed. So began weeks of quiet surveillance. Thompson logged every movement: Elijah's visits to town, Silas's rare appearances, the children's strange routines. Each detail added weight to an invisible scale, tipping toward horror. Wilson consulted Dr. Howard Reynolds, the physician who had delivered the newborn. The doctor's notes confirmed his fears: deformities consistent with generations of consanguinity. Science had written what the sheriff had only suspected. Still, Wilson hesitated. The law in Mississippi didn't have neat boxes for cases like this. What charge could capture something so grotesque? What words in a courtroom could explain such darkness? At night, he sat at his desk, cigarette burning low, staring at photographs of normal families, men fishing with sons, fathers guiding young boys through rituals of life. The Caldwell children would never know that. When another child fell ill, the chance for intervention arrived. Elijah brought the boy to town, coughing and pale, his fragile chest rattling with pneumonia. Doctors confirmed what Wilson already knew: these children weren't safe. It was in that hospital room, under fluorescent light, that Silas finally spoke with a strange calm. He confessed Elijah was the father of the boys, his voice flat, stripped of remorse. Wilson felt rage surge, but also confusion. Was Elijah a perpetrator, or was he manipulated by the older man who seemed to hold every string? The line between victim and criminal blurred dangerously. Still, the sheriff knew he couldn't wait longer. He filed reports, secured warrants, and prepared to bring the swamp's silence crashing down. For the first time, the law was stepping into Devil's Swamp. The investigation was no longer whispers, no longer suspicion. It was an open wound, bleeding into the public eye. And with every new revelation, the Caldwell family's secret threatened to shake Mississippi itself. The Caldwell story deepened when investigators searched the house. What they found inside Devil's Swamp was less a home and more a mausoleum of secrets, each room echoing with silence that felt unnatural. Newspaper clippings plastered the walls, yellowed and curling, as if time itself was frozen there. Crude drawings, figures with distorted faces and twisted limbs, covered scraps of paper left by children who had never known normality. There was no electricity, no running water, only lanterns casting weak circles of light. The house reeked of mildew, damp clothes, and smoke. Every corner whispered neglect, yet carried an eerie sense of deliberate design. The children called Silas father and Elijah brother, but their tones betrayed no awareness of wrongness. They existed in a world built on deception, shaped by a man who believed bloodlines were sacred above all. Investigators found diaries hidden under warped floorboards. Silas's handwriting sprawled across brittle pages, obsessing over lineage, purity, and the need to keep the Caldwell name alive, even if it meant violating nature's most basic laws. In one chilling passage, he wrote, "We are the last true Caldwells. If the line ends, everything ends. The world outside is rotten. Only here, in the swamp, can we remain untainted." Elijah's role was more complex. Evaluations suggested he was trapped in perpetual adolescence, emotionally stunted, unable to separate obedience from autonomy. He followed Silas not out of defiance, but out of conditioned dependence. Some doctors argued Elijah was more victim than villain, molded by manipulation, grief, and fear. Others insisted his silence proved complicity. The debate would haunt every courtroom and every article written about the Caldwell case. The children themselves bore the truth on their bodies. Twisted bones, fragile hearts, delayed speech, every symptom a biological echo of repeated consanguinity. They became living proof of the damage secrecy could inflict over generations. A geneticist, Dr. Lawrence Peterson, explained it bluntly. When bloodlines overlap too closely, hidden weaknesses surface. In the Caldwell boys, those weaknesses weren't hidden at all. They screamed through every fragile breath, every awkward step. Cultural historians added context. Isolated swamp communities had long tolerated cousin marriages, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes tradition. But Silas had carried that legacy further, reshaping it into a doctrine of obsession and control. The swamp itself symbolized this isolation. Like murky water concealing predators, the environment cloaked practices outsiders would never accept. Geography became psychology, cutting the Caldwells off until their rules no longer matched the world's. Neighbors later admitted unease. Some had noticed Elijah's strange behavior, the children's awkward movements, but Southern culture bred silence. "Not our business," one man confessed years later. "We mind our own, even if it kills us." And so silence became complicity. The swamp kept secrets, the town looked away, and Silas built his kingdom of shadows. Each decision layered another brick onto the walls that trapped those children forever. When authorities finally pieced together the bloodlines, they saw 3 generations collapsing inward, folding onto themselves like a snake eating its own tail. The Caldwell name was preserved, but at the cost of unimaginable suffering. What haunted investigators most wasn't just the crime. It was the conviction. Silas never wavered in his belief he was protecting something sacred. In his eyes, the horror wasn't horror at all. It was destiny. The children's wide eyes told a different story. They didn't understand society's laws or nature's warnings, but their quiet, broken bodies carried a truth that no doctrine or diary could erase. Bloodlines had become shadows, stretching across time, swallowing innocence, and leaving behind a legacy that would stain Mississippi's memory forever. The Caldwell secret was no longer contained. It was spreading, demanding to be seen. The trial of Silas and Elijah Caldwell was unlike anything Mississippi courts had faced before. Behind closed doors, judges, lawyers, and doctors gathered, each struggling to define crimes that words could barely contain. Prosecutors charged Silas with exploitation, neglect, and unlawful acts of consanguinity. Yet even the language of law seemed too fragile, too clinical, to describe the twisted world investigators uncovered within Devil's Swamp. Elijah's position complicated everything. Forensic psychiatrists testified he possessed the emotional development of a teenager, stunted by years of manipulation. Was he guilty of participating, or merely a captive shaped by Silas's relentless control? Dr. Richard Matthews, a court-appointed psychiatrist, described Elijah as a man trapped in boyhood. He spoke softly, deferentially, his eyes often lowered. In his presence, one sensed not defiance, but dependency. Silas, by contrast, showed no remorse. He sat upright, voice steady, explaining to the court that he had done nothing wrong. In his mind, he was preserving the Caldwell bloodline against a decaying world. Witnesses recounted their unease over the years. Hunters spoke of shadows in the swamp. A shopkeeper remembered Elijah's nervous purchases. Each testimony layered another stone onto the wall of evidence built against them. Medical experts presented photographs of the Caldwell boys, their deformities documented in painful detail. Doctors explained how repeated genetic overlap caused congenital defects, turning the children's bodies into living proof of hidden abuse. Jurors shifted uneasily in their seats, faces pale. The images weren't just scientific, they were human tragedies, etched into fragile bones, small frames, and the haunted silence of boys who never asked to be born. Defense lawyers argued Elijah's capacity for consent was absent. He was, they claimed, more prisoner than partner, bound by loyalty to the only guardian he had left after his parents' tragic deaths. The court wrestled with a paradox. Could someone be both victim and accomplice, manipulated yet complicit? The question hovered like smoke, clouding every verdict, every argument, every attempt to define justice in legal terms. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed. National newspapers dubbed it the Mississippi Horror, drawing readers with lurid headlines. Yet beneath the sensationalism, real questions about community failure and systemic neglect began to surface. Judge Harold Thompson, weary but resolute, emphasized in his remarks that the trial wasn't only about two men. It was about society's responsibility to intervene before silence turns into generational tragedy. Ultimately, Silas was convicted on all charges, sentenced to 30 years without parole. Elijah was deemed unfit for prison, confined instead to a psychiatric institution where treatment replaced punishment. The verdict left the courtroom divided. Some believed justice was served. Others argued Elijah's fate was too harsh for someone molded by psychological chains. But no one denied the case's unprecedented complexity. For the Caldwell boys, the verdict changed little in the moment. They remained fragile, recovering in medical wards, their futures uncertain. The law could punish Silas, but it could not undo their suffering. Reporters captured the image of Silas leaving the courthouse, eyes forward, lips pressed in grim satisfaction. He didn't look defeated. To him, conviction was meaningless compared to the purity of his distorted beliefs. The trial ended, but the shadows it uncovered lingered. Mississippi had been forced to confront horrors born not of outsiders, but of its own soil, its own silence, and its own neglected swamplands. In the end, the trial of darkness was less about legal verdicts and more about reckoning. A state, a town, and a people forced to see what they had long chosen to ignore. The Caldwell boys became symbols of tragedy. They weren't guilty of their bloodlines, yet they carried its consequences on their small shoulders. Each step, each breath marked by silence and deformity beyond their choosing. Doctors in Jackson examined them carefully, documenting fragile bones, underdeveloped hearts, and delayed speech. Their eyes carried confusion rather than understanding, as though the world around them was too vast, too foreign, too cruel. One boy shuffled when he walked, his legs bent inward. Another's words came out broken, halting, like half-remembered echoes. Their bodies told the story more painfully than any courtroom testimony ever could. Specialists debated their futures. Should they remain together, bound by shared trauma? Or should they be separated, each finding a new life with different families who could provide care, structure, and fragile hope? The boys clung to one another instinctively. Years of isolation had turned them into each other's anchors. They slept side by side, ate from the same plate, and rarely spoke without glancing toward each other. Psychologists noted how silence defined them. They rarely cried, rarely laughed. Instead, they stared at the world with wide, watchful eyes, as if still waiting for the swamp's shadows to swallow them back. A medic described tending to them as like caring for ghosts. They accepted touch but didn't seek it. They obeyed commands but showed little curiosity. Their innocence had been smothered by years of secrecy. Despite everything, sparks of resilience flickered. One boy sketched crude pictures of trees and water, reminding doctors of Devil's Swamp. Another began humming simple tunes, the rhythm shaky but strangely persistent, like memory trying to survive. The community's response was divided. Some townsmen pitied the boys, offering donations or prayers. Others recoiled, whispering about curses and sin, as though the children themselves embodied the darkness rather than endured it. Authorities arranged temporary foster placements while permanent homes were sought. Families willing to take in children with special needs were rare, and these boys required not just care but extraordinary patience and unwavering stability. A pair of school teachers in Jackson accepted 2 brothers. A physician's household in Memphis took the others. Social workers prayed the bonds of brotherhood wouldn't dissolve completely in this necessary separation. Transition was painful. The boys resisted leaving each other's side, their frightened cries breaking through the silence they had once lived in. But slowly, under gentle care, they began adjusting to new surroundings. Doctors visited frequently, monitoring their progress. Some conditions could be managed, heart surgeries, speech therapy, physical treatment, but others were irreversible. The damage done by generations of secrecy had already carved itself too deeply. Still, professionals marveled at small victories. One boy learned to write his name, clumsy letters scratched across paper. Another managed to ride a bicycle with training wheels, a smile breaking across his usually blank face. These tiny triumphs became monuments of resilience. Against all odds, the boys were proving that silence didn't have to define them forever, that even children born from horror could carve out fragments of normalcy. Yet the scars remained. Nightmares woke them often. They recoiled at raised voices, startled at sudden sounds, clung to foster fathers with the desperation of boys terrified of being abandoned again. Their story became a lesson for the state. Mississippi couldn't erase what had been done, but it could learn. No child, no matter how isolated, should be left to suffer unseen. The children of silence were fragile, yes, but they were also living reminders. Their lives carried a message sharper than any courtroom speech. What neglect hides, compassion must heal, even if healing takes a lifetime. The Caldwell case did not end in the courtroom. Its shadows stretched far beyond Mississippi, forcing lawmakers, doctors, and communities to confront what isolation and silence could create when left unchecked for generations. Medical teams from the University of Mississippi compiled detailed reports on the boys. Their research became one of the first comprehensive studies on extreme consanguinity in America, shedding light on genetic risks once hidden in folklore. Doctors recorded microcephaly, congenital heart defects, developmental delays, evidence of recessive genes magnified by repeated inbreeding. Each child became a living testament to the dangers of closing a family's doors too tightly against the outside world. For researchers, the Caldwell tragedy was a cautionary map. It showed how bloodlines could collapse inward like caves, burying innocence under the weight of secrecy, obsession, and warped ideas of purity disguised as survival. Lawmakers responded with reforms. Child protection services received expanded authority. Social workers were trained to recognize warning signs of isolation, and policies emphasized intervention in rural families long forgotten by the system. Governor Paul Johnson, Jr. addressed the state directly, calling the Caldwell scandal a failure not just of individuals but of society. Mississippi, he insisted, could never again allow children to vanish into swamps of neglect. Historians drew broader lessons. They traced patterns of isolated communities across the Delta, places where poverty and geography forged rules separate from mainstream society, breeding both resilience and, at times, deeply destructive traditions. The Caldwell legacy was studied in classrooms, written in books, whispered in conferences. It became a symbol of what happens when cultural silence hardens into complicity, and complicity calcifies into generational tragedy. Some saw Silas as a relic of an older South, unyielding, obsessed with lineage, convinced the world outside his swamp was poisoned. Others saw him as an aberration, a warning of obsession turned madness. Elijah's fate deepened the debate. In psychiatric care, he remained childlike, never fully grasping the weight of his actions. Experts questioned whether he was perpetrator, pawn, or both, blurred by years of manipulation. Journalists called it the trial of darkness, but scholars reframed it as the legacy of horror, a story less about crime and more about systemic failure, human fragility, and the monstrous power of isolation. The swamp house itself was eventually demolished, yet locals swore its ruins lingered in memory. Hunters told tales of hearing faint cries near the cypress groves, echoes of children long removed but never forgotten. Folklore painted the Caldwells as specters haunting the Delta, shadows warning passers-by about pride, secrecy, and silence. Fact and myth merged until the swamp became both real geography and symbolic warning. Survivors of similar hidden families came forward, emboldened by the publicity. Their testimonies proved the Caldwells weren't alone. Isolation had many faces, some less extreme, but all carrying the seeds of silence's poison. Academics emphasized vigilance. Communities, they argued, had to look beyond fences, dirt roads, and floodplains, because behind them could live boys unseen, unheard, waiting for someone brave enough to pierce the silence. The Caldwell boys themselves became private symbols of resilience. Despite fragile health, they learned, grew, and slowly embraced fragments of normal life, embodying the truth that even horror could not completely erase humanity. And so the legacy of horror was twofold. It showed the grotesque cost of neglect, but also the stubborn endurance of children who refused to be entirely defined by the sins of their bloodline. Time passed, yet the Caldwell story never truly faded. Like fog clinging to cypress branches, its memory lingered across Mississippi, carried in hushed conversations and retold as warnings in small-town gatherings. By the late 70s, the swamp house stood abandoned, its wood rotting, roof sagging, windows shattered. Locals avoided the path entirely, claiming the land carried curses too heavy to risk disturbing. Children dared each other to approach Devil's Swamp, whispering that cries still drifted at night. Hunters swore they saw flickering lights deep in the trees, as though lanterns guided by unseen hands. Folklore transformed Silas into a phantom patriarch, forever guarding bloodlines in the swamp's mist. Elijah became a spectral boy, wandering endlessly, unable to grow, trapped in obedience long after his body was gone. Yet beyond myth, the echoes remained grounded in reality. Court records, medical journals, and survivor testimonies ensured the Caldwell name would never fully dissolve into ghost stories. It stood as documented tragedy. The Caldwell boys, now grown, carried the shadows within them. Some found fragile independence, others required lifelong care, but all bore scars, physical and invisible, that marked them as children forged in silence. One learned painting, turning pain into color. Another found solace in quiet routines, working in sheltered environments. Their survival itself became defiance against the swamp that had once imprisoned their beginnings. Community members reflected with unease. Some admitted knowing something was wrong but chose silence. Others confessed disbelief that such horror could unfold so close, hidden behind the veil of Southern privacy. Academics revisited the case for decades. Lectures at universities framed the Caldwell tragedy as a mirror, forcing America to confront uncomfortable truths about neglect, isolation, and society's reluctance to intervene when danger whispers. In 1992, county workers finally demolished the Caldwell house. Boards collapsed into muck, erasing physical remnants. Yet many felt the swamp itself resisted closure, its waters swallowing the ruins without cleansing the memory. Local folklore kept evolving. Stories of strange shadows and unnatural cries continued, told around campfires. Some used them to frighten boys into obedience, others as lessons about secrecy, family, and unchecked pride. The phrase Caldwell silence entered regional speech, describing situations where communities ignored obvious danger. It became shorthand for collective failure, the danger of pretending not to hear, not to see, not to question. For survivors, echoes were deeply personal. Nightmares persisted, triggered by storms or heavy rain. The swamp wasn't just geography. It lived in their minds, carried in memories they could never fully escape. Social workers built training programs inspired by the case. They urged vigilance in rural communities, teaching that shadows behind closed doors might hide children desperate for rescue, boys waiting for someone to intervene. Doctors continued studying consanguinity, citing the Caldwell case as a cornerstone. What was once dismissed as rural gossip became an academic reference, shaping medicine, law, and ethics for generations of professionals across America. And yet, the deepest echo wasn't scientific or legal. It was human. 4 boys pulled from silence, each carrying scars, yet proving life could still bloom, however fragile, after years in darkness. The swamp remains. Mist still rises over its waters, branches still twist skyward. Travelers pass quickly, unwilling to linger, sensing that some places never forget the horrors rooted in their soil. Echoes in the swamp remind us that silence is never harmless. Left unchallenged, it festers, grows, and swallows lives. The Caldwell story remains a warning carved into Mississippi's soul, a darkness never fully erased.